Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host and moderator, and I'm also the creator and the publisher of thechocolatelife.com. Today, we're going to be joined by a special guest, Frank Homann, who is the founder and CEO of CHOCOA Gourmet. But before we do that, what I want to do is remind everybody that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode, is supported by the members of the Chocolate Life. If you're not a member, please go over there and join. And also, to say, I forgot what I was going to say. So let's go and welcome Frank to the episode. Hey, Frank, how are you today?
Yeah, I'm good.
Good. And, this is, a really interesting reunion for me, right? Because, I've known of you since before 2014, right? I've known of your work in Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. Through CHOCO and the planting of cocoa. And then I, also met you in person, maybe not for the first time, but it would have been at CHOCOA or the Academy of Chocolate in 2014, where you made some presentations about the cost of producing cocoa. And as I was thinking about how the current the volatility in the cocoa market is right now, I immediately cast back to this chart that you presented. I mean, I have this really, really strong awareness of this chart that you created, right? And I thought, wow, when I went and found it in my archive of everything that I has, I go, oh, wow, this is a really, really interesting, very, very prescient view of the marketplace. And that's what we're going to discuss today. It's like, we're going to discuss volatility of the cocoa market, but we're also going to be talking about the Frank Homann CHOCOA Gourmet view of the world, right? If we can. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to say, my understanding is that CHOCOA was founded in about 2007. But what is it that led to the formation of CHOCOA? I mean, I remember vaguely that you were a management consultant, but how do you go from being a management consultant to getting involved in cocoa farming in Latin America?
Yeah, like most things in life, one thing leads to the next and so forth. Management consulting background originally, I guess that has a link down to, making a lot of net present value analysis. No, that's how you value businesses if you are in business. Shares are valued that way, et cetera, et cetera. So applying that technique to the cacao world, I found out was quite novel in the cacao world, which is always nice, no? So you can make some.
While we're there, excuse me, Frank, I'm going to interrupt while we're there.
Sure.
There are two things. Number one is if you're watching live, whether on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, please go into the live chat or the comments and let us know where in the world you're connecting from. I'll get that shout out up on screen. And if you have a question that you want to ask or a comment you want to make about today's, get it into the comments. We'll get it up on screen. And if it's a question, we'll get the question asked of Frank and answer it. So before we go further, Frank, that was what I forgot. It's like this momentary lapse of reason. For people who may not be aware with that term, what does net present value mean, right? And if you can, why is it an analytical tool that's not normally applied to agriculture?
Yeah, it's weird. It isn't. It must be somewhere hidden. Somewhere, somebody with thick glasses in a dark office somewhere in the big corporations must be doing something like this. No, but I just haven't seen it. So net present value is very simply put that you estimate future cash flows. And then you discount it by a risk factor that applies to the business. So typically a startup business would have a very high risk factor, 30% or something like that. No? And if you're an established brick and mortar business, you're down in 5-6%. I think, Barry Callebaut is at 8%, if I don't remember poorly. And so you discount the money back to today's value. And that way, if the value is more than zero, then it's a business that you can go ahead with. If it's less than zero, the rule of thumb is then you shouldn't go ahead with this business. Of course, there's some inaccuracy around a model like this, especially in how do you actually forecast the future cash flows, which in cacao is actually relatively simple because you can estimate the average yield per hectare. We have data for that. We have regressive analysis of the pricing. It's very volatile for commodity cacao, though, but we can more or less get an idea of where it is, right? So we can start to figure out, are you in the money or not? And it depends very much where you are in the world in producing cacao. Some places, like in Africa, a farmer is happy with $1 a day in opportunity cost, whereas in Central America, Ecuador is like $10. It's a long explanation.
Are farmers really happy with $1 a day? I mean,
well, no, probably not. But that's the opportunity cost. No, if it's below $1, people will typically, in economics terms, and we're only talking economics here, not actual real people. It's like the world of assessing things with numbers. No, so you would say, okay, if it's less than $1, people would typically go and get another job or plant tomatoes instead of cacao or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So you're in a management consulting firm. It occurs to me it's McKinsey. And then you were approached by a colleague of yours, a McKinsey colleague of yours, who had become involved with an NGO, an operation called TechnoServe. Mm-hmm. And people who are in the world of cocoa know TechnoServe. So for many years, for example, USAID gave TechnoServe the money, which was used to affect cocoa policy in Peru. Yeah. Right. So TechnoServe is involved in cocoa and many other things around the world. And that's how you got to Latin America. And so you show up and you're in Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and you see cocoa for the first time and you go, what?
Yes, I guess so. I should say that after McKinsey,
or tell the story your way, because I'm interested.
Yeah, exactly. I should say that after McKinsey,
my memory of your story.
I did 5 years where I co-founded a high-tech company and lived in the US, by the way, for a while. Exited from that and spent a year with my kids in Mexico, and then a former colleague from McKinsey who was involved with TechnoServe asked me to do a consulting stint half-time, when I was away when the mother had the kids. And so I did that. And I actually think I started pioneering the cocoa practice within TechnoServe, at least to find cocoa practice. I don't think anything had been done before on it. So we started in Honduras. The project was in Honduras. I think it was sponsored by Cargill. And we looked at a local cocoa processing plant, and we looked at how couldn't farmers differentiate their cacao, or how can they get out of poverty actually growing cacao. And so what was pretty clear from the get-go was that cacao is a commodity product, so there's no way you can differentiate it. So if you're a Honduran farmer, you basically sell to the same price as an African farmer, right? So that way, in Honduras, everybody were out of the money. You didn't, a business plan for a small farm, and you say it wasn't in the money. So not surprisingly, and nobody were really doing much with cacao. I guess if you had a piece of land, you didn't know what to grow on it. It was easy to just seed plant some cacao, and you'd get a little bit of an income stream, but very low yield and very low income streams from cacao at that stage. The idea then was, can we differentiate? And the answer was yes. There's actually a way of differentiating, and that is by growing fine flavor cacao. And so
let's jump into that, Frank, because I think it's important. So for everybody who is a regular watcher will know that I produce a post for every episode of Pot Safe Chocolate. This is the post for today's episode. If you go to the homepage of the Chocolate Life, you'll see it's pinned to the top rail. And if you're interested, you can go see a list of previous episodes on this page. But what I wanted to do was scroll down here. And, Frank, as I mentioned earlier, I was able to find the presentations that you gave in 2014, right? And what I want to do is I want to walk through that thinking about the economic model, and as you're creating it, like about differentiation, right? Because the economics of this is what I think is important here, is understanding sort of a foundational understanding of what I think of as true cost, right? To get to an understanding for what should the farm gate price of cocoa be if it's going to be a sustainable business for farmers, right? So would you agree that that's, sort of the genesis about how do we differentiate? And so just so everybody, we're going to focus on 7 slides But both of these presentations, you can download them. Frank has given me permission to post them here, and you can download them. And so you can go there. So Frank, let's, this is slide number 2 in your deck, right? Yep. So number 1 about differentiation is differentiation around flavor, right? Mm-hmm. So this was an early foundational understanding that you had in putting together the business plan for CHOCO.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
So this is 2014. This is 2000. The presentation is 2014. This realization comes back in about 2007. What has changed between 2014 and today when you look at this slide? Anything?
No, I think it's always a question of what is fine cacao. Of course, after we started CHOCOA, and before that, we were thinking about these things in an NGO context. There wasn't a lot of thinking about fine flavor cacao, but then ICCO started to, acknowledge more cacaos as fine, and it became a little bit of a political question. And I think the term might have been a little bit diluted. Today, I would probably be more specific around fine flavor. It's very difficult to say because it's kind of like what is a good flavor? The only way that makes sense is what cacao is actually sold at a significant price premium. And I'm not saying $200 above market, because they do that for traceable cacao or for organic cacao, but that's not fine flavor, right? Fine flavor, I would say, is anything that trades at a significant premium to bulk. And so it's probably less than 5% in real terms. No, I think there's a little bit of an exaggeration on maybe the Ecuadorian part, especially, how much it's actually selling for in terms of premium. I don't think it's a whole lot. And unfortunately, a lot of fine flavor cacao is being exported to large companies that then over roast it and trying to take away flavors that are unwanted and making a homogeneous product. And that's the way you do it. And that again takes away the fine flavor part of the fine flavor cacao. So often it becomes like this game of origins today. It's sort of like everything has been adopted by the big industry guys. So they heard the craft chocolate lingua and they started to use those expressions. So today it's kind of like it's very difficult to know exactly what's behind all of this. But I don't think it has grown. The fine flavor, yes, it has actually. I think Peru weren't around back then as a flavor origin. I think there's a lot of great craft bars I've gotten with Peruvian cacao. It's very, very good. It's a new place where you can find a lot of good cacao. Ecuador was around. I think it has developed since. Haven't followed it closely. But apart from that, maybe it's the same old. Africa hasn't really moved in that direction at all, for instance.
Right, but one of the things, if I can't say, one of the things that we have seen that's a little bit different, if I can, is that programs like the Cacao of Excellence, right, are looking to try to describe what I'm going to use the word specialty cocoa because I like specialty coffee. So any specialty cup of coffee is a coffee that's made with specialty coffee beans, which have received a Q grading score above a certain point. Right? And I think that ultimately, I don't like the word fine because it's so nebulous. We can talk about specialty, right? Cocoa beans the same way we talk about specialty chocolate. A specialty chocolate is made with specialty cocoa beans, and we're working towards a grading system, which we can all agree on. Now, we're not there, and it's going to take a lot to get there, I think. And so we're going to have interim definitions. But, one of the challenges I have around the word fine is if we look at your market, if you look at your image here, it's like 95% of the market is not fine. And so if I'm interested in fine cocoa, does that mean I'm not interested in the work of 95% of cocoa farmers in the world, which I think is a dangerous place to be. In any event, I mean, I think it's fair to say, if I can, that the impetus for CocoaNomics right, rather than CocoaNomics, XOCOnomics, CHOCOANomics,
Mhm.
is this understanding that one of the ways that cocoa farmers can increase income is how do they differentiate themselves from the bulk and commodity market, however
Mhm.
that's going to be, right?
Yep.
And right
Yep.
now that, back in 2014, it represents about 5% of the market. I don't think much has changed
Yep.
in the interim. So if that's the case, then here is the other aspect of this. I mean, behind every cell in a spreadsheet, there's a person, right? When we're talking about, the economics of things, you make a
Yep.
decision on a spreadsheet and affects farmers' lives. And this is what you found back in 2014. Here is the reality, right? That the typical fine cocoa farmer has a small farm. They live in what we define as poverty.
Mhm.
They're barely earning $1.30 a day per family member, right?
Yep. Yep.
And they're involved in what's called subsistence farming.
Yep.
So part of what it is they're growing is for their own consumption, and part of what it is that they're growing they sell off. And
Yep.
it could be coffee, cocoa, bananas, other things that they're growing on their farm.
Mhm.
This was back in 2014. Has any aspect of this really changed?
No, it's actually pretty much the same for farmers in Honduras now. When you go and see, a lot of people still live in under these conditions now, and yeah, cocoa farmers tend to be very small. The plot of land that they have is very small, less than 2 hectares on average, right? And they're like diversified. They have animals as well. They might have some corn and some rice and beans and stuff, no, for their own consumption, etc., etc. But what they want to go and buy outside, or the money they need to send their kids to school or go to the doctor, get medicine, that's from cash crops like cacao, right? So it's very important for these people, that income stream. No? So let me just back and say, for the history of CHOCO, I was a stint as a consultant to an NGO. I decided that the NGO world was not for me. I was an entrepreneur, so I thought this is not going anywhere. There's a lot of talk. It's not really leading to impact. So I decided to start CHOCO. So CHOCO is a for-profit private company. We started in 2007. Has nothing to do with an NGO. And our first focus was on producing fine flavor beans, and then later on we started to make our own chocolate, and today we do couverture chocolate, B2B chocolate that we sell mainly in Europe. Just to get the story straight, no? From where I come from, but we do have those roots of, how can we help people in the value chain to get to a level where they can have a decent life, because it's simply not acceptable that you eat a nice dessert with couverture chocolate and somebody produced that cacao that you're eating, and that person can't afford to go to send his kids to the doctor or to school, right? That's not acceptable. We live in 2024. We're adults, and we need to take responsibility for what we do, right? And so we need to price chocolate, cacao in a way so everybody's fine, right? And that's just human. And I think when you're a small company like ours, that we're vertically integrated, you see the whole chain and you understand this perfectly clear. I'm not sure if you're the CEO of one of the big chocolate companies and maybe you go for a 2-3 day walk of cacao farm somewhere in the tropics, right, that you totally get it, right? I'm not sure that they really understood the economics behind. I'm afraid to say so. I don't think they're evil people at all. I think they're not stupid people either. They cannot be. It's just so for some reason they haven't been down to the reality of their business, I must say.
Yeah, I have the same sort of opinion when it comes to, or the same sort of feeling when it comes to, NGOs in the quote unquote fair trade space. I mean, I believe that the people who are involved in those organizations truly believe in what it is they're doing, and they're providing value and doing good. They're not quote unquote evil people, right? But, I wonder how many of the people who are sitting in an office in Bonn, right, looking at, fairly traded cocoa in West Africa, have actually spent more than a day or two, right, looking at a cocoa farm. If you've been there for 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, a year, really, involved in the day-to-day, you'd have this better understanding.
Right.
And as I mentioned, if you're working on a spreadsheet, every single time you make a change in that spreadsheet, you're affecting somebody's lives on the other end, right?
Yep.
And if you don't have that visceral personal connection with things, it often gets lost. So one of the things that really, really also interests me is this, right? Because when many people think about like cocoa farming, they're going to go, oh, if I'm going to go sort of like rehabilitate farmland, and I've got a couple of hectares of what used to be cow pasture land, and I want to convert it into cocoa farming. They talk about $1,000 per hectare or something like that to do the rehabilitation and planting. And what this suggests is that there's a misapprehension of what it actually costs to get a cocoa farm from a raw state into something which is going to be, fully productive over the course of, somewhere between 4 and 5 years. So this came about. So I just want to ask, this came about as a result of the work that you were doing, between 2007 when you founded CHOCO, and you're going to go try to do this, and 2014. You understood that this is what it really takes. If you want to do 100 hectares, you better have $1 million to invest in doing it. Right.
And you need probably a minimum of 100 hectares, because if you want to ferment, it's very important that you do that correctly, and you need to have like a ton of wet mass in order to get a good, in our experience, a good fermentation. No? And so if you want to do fermentations all year round, then you need a minimum of 100 hectares in order to fill those boxes all year round. No? So that's a minimum ticket if you want to go in. Unless you're a group or a cooperative, of course, or similar. No? But if you want to be independent, 100 hectares is a minimum ticket to play.
So 100 hectares, whether you're an estate holder, so you own the land and you're hiring the employees, that's the one way of thinking about it, or you're a cooperative of farmers who get together, what you want to do, this sort of represents, sort of a minimum investment. And my guess is, I'm looking over here and I see this $450,000 representing, almost half. I mean, this is the carrying cost to get you from, okay, I've just planted my first set of trees, to I have something that I can start selling, right? Which I think is very, very interesting. So, so one of the things which I think is really, really interesting about all of this is that, I know now, right, that, places like Guatemala and Nicaragua have just insane histories when it comes to the genetics of, specialty cocoa. I mean, I think about that. And, CHOCO helped reveal a lot of these to the world. I mean, you literally found many of them and started planting them. So you talk about that experience for us as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting story in a way, because it's very, very simple. Because what we've done in CHOCO is simply what has been done in all other fruit categories. Cacao is a fruit tree. It grows only in the tropics, of course. But all fruit trees that grow here in Europe or in the US, in temperate climates like apples, cherries, pears, grapes for wine, every single plantation has been planted with single variety fruits. And what is single variety? Well, the Romans started this idea because 2,000 years ago, the very simple idea of grafting for variety, for flavor. The story goes that 2,000 years ago, no farmers ate apples because they were all seed planted. And when you seed plant an apple, you probably have tried wild apples. They're very small, they're very bitter, right? Nobody ate them back then until genetics. One of these seed planted trees actually had a red juicy apple, and the Roman farmer went, okay, I figure out how to graft, which is simply you take a branch from that tree that you want to reproduce and you cut it off and you stick it on another tree. And if it gets stuck there and it's successful, it starts to grow into a tree that's a copy of the first one, right? And then you get the same flavor apple. No? And that's how Romans started to eat apples. That's how the first apple variety was founded, right? And that's 2,000 years ago. Today we have 7,000 different varieties. Each variety has different flavors, right? So that are different, right? It's genetic. And a very simple definition is that all the fruits taste the same. So when I came to the cacao industry, that was very blurry. That was not clear to anybody. people thought that, oh, Criollo is a variety, or Forastero is a variety, or Trinitario is a variety. It's not, right? It's a genetic grouping that has, so much different wild cacao, all with different flavors within it. Criollo is not one flavor. It's many flavors. I've had nutty, bitter, fruity criollos from different places, right? And it's simply because it's wild cacao. It's never been planted by grafting like the Romans did 2,000 years ago. So what Choco's notion was, why don't we do like it's been done in Europe and in the temperate climates in developed countries and do it with cacao? And so the first 3 or 4 varieties we have here are simply that we found in nature wild cacao that had a flavor that was interesting, which is not as easy to find out as in apples. In apples, you just bite into the apple, right? You get immediate feedback. Yeah. Cacao is very difficult, because you have to ferment and dry, and you have to roast it. You have to do it all really well in order to taste the true potential of it. Also, it took a long time. It was not easy. And that's also probably why it hasn't been done before in cacao. No? But that's how I see the future of cacao. Then you can start talking about differentiation. Then you can talk about more producer power, right? Because there's no apple farmer in Europe who lives in poverty who can't send his kids to school, right? That would be unheard of, no? And the same thing should be the case, of course, for a cacao farmer. It doesn't make sense.
Right. Yeah, one of the things that I've said on many, many occasions, that if cacao grew in the Loire Valley in France, we wouldn't be having these discussions about farmer poverty. Right.
Not at all.
Right. And if the hops, and this is a conversation that I had with David Nilsson who does the Bean to Barstool podcast, is that if hops grew in equatorial Africa, we'd be having the same discussion about beer that we're having about chocolate today, which is really, a really interesting way of thinking about it. And, just so I don't, this is a bit of my history, is I spent part of the summer on an apple orchard in around Lake Chelan or Wenatchee. I think it's Lake Chelan, Washington. This was many, many years ago, where I was thinning apple trees. Right. So I'd actually go up into the trees on an orchard ladder. And the tree would have set maybe 40 fruits, and we only want 10 of them so that they all grow big. And so we don't, it made intuitive sense to me when you were talking about this, that if we think about cacao the way we think about apples and grapes, I mean, there was one mother Cabernet Sauvignon vine somewhere in the world in history, and all of the Cabernet Sauvignon grapes that are grown everywhere in the world are clones, they're grafts from this one mother tree. Right?
That's right.
And one of the things that you mentioned to me, which I didn't know as part of the story, even though I spent on and off like over 3 years working in Nicaragua, was the origin of the name Chuno, which is you guys named, Choco named. How did the name Chuno come about?
Well, Chuno had a farm, and on that farm we found a variety that was very interesting. So we called it Chuno to start off with. Today we call it Tuma Yellow. There's a little bit of naming discussions there, etc. So that's how we started off in Nicaragua. No, so the year after we started in Honduras 2007, and then in 2008 we started up in Nicaragua. In both places we had a lot of issues with getting grafting right. How difficult can it be? I'm not an
incredibly difficult. Incredibly difficult at scale. Grafting at scale is incredibly
difficult. The first
year
in Nicaragua, we had to throw out 60,000 trees that were costing at $2 a piece, to make it. And I was like, that was terrible.
But going back to that, there was a man, I assume, by the name of Chuno.
Yes.
Right.
Chuno, variety. Unfortunately, passed away. COVID here.
Yeah, you mentioned that is unfortunate. So, but I think that there is a history. In Peru we have the Fortunato variety. It's named after a farmer, right? And so we have an eponymous varieties, which I just think it's a wonderful story. My understanding, you mentioned that you also coined the term rugoso, even though it's a trade term now. But my understanding is that means rough. Rugoso means rough. Is that because of the pods themselves? All right. All right. So again, for me, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with you is, number one, to understand a little bit more about the economic model, but also there are these wonderful little details that people often get wrong They just don't. And I, from where I, come from, these details are really, really important when you're trying to convey the story. And so I'm really, really happy that you're here sharing them with me today.
Thank you.
And having said that,
share it with you.
Well,
I love this topic.
No, I know you do. I mean, I know the enthusiasm. And what I want to do is I want to let people know we're about halfway through today's episode. If you want to, whether you're watching on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, go in and put the comment on screen. Let us know where in the world you're connecting from. We'll get it up on screen. If you have a question for Frank about anything that he's doing within the CHOCO universe, please get that up on screen. And what I want to do, Frank, to start the second half of this episode, is to go over and talk about the mother of slides, right? When I said, 2014, I'm in a conference room in the Beurs van Berlage in Amsterdam at CHOCOA, and you present this slide. And I'm going, oh my God, what it is that's going on here. But before, number one is, if you're watching this, this may be on screen too small. So if you get an opportunity, you can go and look at it on another screen, or afterwards, this image is on the Chocolate Life, and you can go and look at it yourself and follow along with what we're doing. Obviously, an audio podcast, you're going to have to follow along with the visuals later on. And Frank, before you jump in, what I want to do is I want to say hello to a good friend and colleague from Sao Paulo, Brazil, Arcelia Gallardo, who's the founder of Mission Chocolate, who does fabulous work, lovely person. And I want to say, hey, Arcelia, thanks for giving us a shout out today. Appreciate your joining us today. And if you have questions for Frank about any of this, please put them into the comments as well. So Frank, net present value. So the net present value has to do with discounting future cash flow to today's
value of money.
Today's value of money.
Yep.
Right. And then deciding if the project is something that should be invested in. Right.
Yep.
So what you did, and what I'm going to do, look a little closer here. Maybe what I can do is I can also make this a little larger. Nope, it's about as large as it's going to get. Can I? Oh, here we go. So what you've done is you've created a number of categories in terms of costs, right? And so this is, you need to think about preparing and cleaning the land and the labor associated with it, grafting and planting trees, maintenance, all kinds of other maintenance, all these other costs, which you need to think about. And many of these costs, some of these costs only occur once. So they're in the setup of the farm. And then many of these costs are recurring costs. And so how do we get so we have bean production. So, after 4 years, we're at 5% production. After 5 years, we're at 20. And one of the great things about doing it in the spreadsheet is you can change some of your assumptions with actual values over time. So you can see how you're tracking here, right? But what we do is that we end up with, at the end of, even at the 4-year mark, what the farm gate price, and again, this is going back to 2014, the farm gate price has got to be close to $9 a kilo when it comes to fine flavor flavor cocoa. So this is the farm gate price in order to make the investment of the $1 million that we were talking about for those 100 hectares, right? Worthwhile. So can you explain a little bit more about, the actual mathematics? Because I don't have the formula. I don't have the formulas here, right? I just have the screenshots. So how, again, this is where, so if somebody were to go and want to do this for themselves, right? They're thinking about getting into cocoa, starting a new farm. How would they go about, what are the formulas behind some of these things that they need to think about in order to be able to do this work for themselves?
Right. Yeah, first of all, if you're lucky enough to have $1 million floating around to invest, then you would say, okay, what are my alternatives with this $1 million? No, so I can put it in, cheap bonds, and that's probably nowadays with inflation all 5 or 6% or something. No, I can get some return, and it's zero risk, basically. Or I can invest it in the index of the stock market and maybe get 7-8% return on that $1 million. Now I'm taking a little bit more risk, but it's still on the conservative side. If I start my own business, the risk factor is around 30%. If it's a high-tech startup or something like that, a venture capitalist will tell you it's 30%, rule of thumb. Now, if I want to do a farm, there's a lot of risk factors. For the first of all, you're doing a farm in a tropical country. Tropical countries tend to have a legal structure that is not the same as it is in more developed countries. No, so you have a hard time with contracts. No, if people break contracts, if that actually has a cost. There's a cost to wind and weather. You get hurricanes that come in, all sorts of tropical diseases. You may have a workforce that's not always trained or available even. So there's a lot of risk factors. No, and if you are in Honduras and you want to go to the bank and they lend you money for an agricultural project, it's around 30%. So here I put 24% as a discount factor. Is probably conservative, is generous, but it's a realistic discount factor. That's the risk you take if you establish a cacao farm. I can't remember exactly where I got to 24%, but it must have been one of the countries I took it from. And so that's one factor that's very important. So it's not a risk-free investment by no means. No. Then there's the labor cost. That's very important in cacao. Cacao is not so mechanized, and this is not a mechanized farm. It has no irrigation. It's a 3x3 meter planting, so 1,000 trees per hectare. You would typically need 1 worker per 3 hectares, something like that. 3-4 hectares, something like that, depending on how well organized you are and how good they are at working. Especially in the beginning, you need more work, right? Then there's the peak production. I put here a kilo, which is actually very generous. A lot of trees that are non-grafted, non-selected would go much lower than that. It's actually something I learned from a bitter experience. We had to field graft a lot of our farms afterwards and outgrower farms, because it turned out that the flavor was really good of our varieties, but some of them just didn't produce very much. Right? Yeah. So productivity is also genetic. So you have to have a good selection to get to 1 kilo. And so a kilo is optimistic. It's good for a non-irrigated farm, 3x3. So of course you have to find a piece of land that is agreeable. No, a lot of people think, oh, I can get a piece of land a hectare for 1,000. Yes, but then it's going to be flooded half the year. No, that's not a good thing. Or it's so far away from civilization that you can't find a workforce or a manager, and you don't go visit yourself, right? So you have to probably pay, even in developing countries, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a hectare, right, in order to get something that's appropriate for cacao. So those are some of the main assumptions, and of course there's some costs, inputs there. No, you have to prepare land. That's not an easy thing. No, sometimes you need to deep plow, subsoiling, these kind of things, remove rocks, etc., etc. You have to graft trees. It's actually, if you need 100,000 trees, I put $100,000 for it. That's actually a little bit optimistic. It could be more. Maintenance, labor, weed control, that's cost a lot of money. These are actual numbers I can verify. With administration, maintenance, fermentation, drying, sales and marketing. If you have your own farm here, the assumption is that you have a farm and you sell directly to customers in the chocolate makers, right? So these are conservative minimum costs, no, and that gives a pretty, that total of $1 million, no.
Yeah, and I can look at this and say, for example, there's no debt service here, right? So, right. This is assuming that you have all that money as cash and you don't owe anything. Right. So there are lots of things. But I do want to point out, so my understanding about EBITDA is expenses before income tax, depreciation, and amortization.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So, what happens is that if you go take a look here at year 1, your total out is 310. So you're down, your expenses, you're in the hole $310,000, right?
That's right.
And then the second year you're down $145,000. So it's not until year 5 that you start to turn cash flow positive. Is that the way to think of that number?
Yeah, that's break even.
All right. All right. So I'm just for people who might be less familiar with putting together the spreadsheet, which is associated with the business plan. I've been in like half a dozen high-tech startups. And so I look at these things and I have some. So it looks like we're, $500,600, we're like $700,000 down before we start turning positive cash flow. And we don't actually, earn back the million investment until like year 9 or something like that. I mean, and that's assuming that, we've done everything right in terms of forecasting what our expenses are. Right.
Exactly.
That labor cost is where it is. And, Frank, again, this is in 2014 dollars. Right. And so we're not in 2014 anymore. We're in 2024. Right. And so one of the things that I would say is this is $8.88 in constant dollar terms. Right.
Yeah, I think looking at the numbers, they're not far off today. It's still $9-10 per labor day, for instance, in Honduras and Nicaragua, these places, Guatemala.
Right, which means that the minimum wage in the United States has not kept up with inflation. Right. And so, one of the concerns I have is when people say, oh, the price of cocoa has hit 10,000 a ton or 12,000 a ton. It's the highest it's ever been. Yeah, that's in constant dollar terms. But if we go back and look at the 7,800 that it was back in 1977, and we count for inflation, right, the record high is actually nowhere near the record high. We still have a long way to go before we do that.
Okay. That's an interesting expression.
So it's an interesting thing to do. Go look at the price in 1977, right, where it hit $7,800 a ton or something like that. And then just do the, what was $7,800 in $1977, right? What is that in $2024? And you go, oh my gosh. And of course, that depends on which currency you're looking at and whose rate of inflation. I mean, rate of inflation of the United States has been much lower in general than many other countries. So all of these things are, they're fascinating discussions, but they need to be thought about in a much more sophisticated way when it comes to thinking about the cost of money and the value of money. Right? We have, for the most part, we have this romantic notion about cocoa farming, and yes, I mean, you and I know from high tech, how do you make a small fortune in the internet? You start with the big one. Right? How do you make a small fortune in chocolate? You start with the big one. There's a lot of similarity there.
Right.
But what's really interesting here is coming out the other side. You've got this slide, right? And you go to this one, which is a little further on, which you and I were talking about this before the episode started, and you know what? There's not a whole lot of difference in the course of 10 years, right? There's very little about, your projections for prices and costs back in 2014 have changed.
Yes, it's amazing. And especially in the middle one, I think it's interesting. It says 187 for an African farmer, right? An African farmer, instead of $9 a day, they expect $1 a day. At least when I looked at it in 2014, it's very, very low compared to Latin America. And therefore, when they get 189, that's when they're sort of just in the money, right? But if it's below, then they're not in the money. It's marginal cost for them. And they're just going, what should I do? Should I go to Accra and get myself a job, or should I grow tomatoes? And my theory of Africa is that there's probably, or West Africa in particular, is that there are not many alternatives, right? So if you're out there far away on a cacao farm, what are the alternatives to cacao? No, if I grow tomatoes, is anybody going to buy it from me? Or is it just cacao that the government comes by and buys every week or 2 weeks or whatever they do? My impression is that there's an oversupply from Africa because African farmers, even if they're not really in the money, they're below 187. I think fair trade price 2-3 years ago was 180. So and not many people would get that. Very little of the harvest was for fair trade. So I think most people in Ghana would get 140 in Cote d'Ivoire. So they were below the 189 NPV and so price. So they're not in the money, and that's probably also why they underinvested last year. Nobody had money to buy fertilizers. not least because of the war in Ukraine. People wouldn't be pruning their farms as they should, so it was more prone to disease, less productivity, and I think that's the reason why the main reason people are going climate change and tree deaths, and that might also have been factors, but supply only went down with 11%. No, it's not a huge number. Prices went up 3 to 4 times from what they were.
Right. So, there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of nuance and detail that, goes on there. So one of the things that I this is a theory of mine, and, I think that you've talked around it, but, given your background, I want you to talk about it a little bit, is that at this $1.87, $1.89 number, what it means is that this is barely enough for the family to survive, right? It's not enough to reinvest in the farm, right? And so if we look at the policy of big chocolate and governments in the largest cocoa producing regions, what they've been done is, I don't know if they're actually colluding, but their actions together have led to suppressing the farm gate price, right? Over the course of at least 60 years, if not more like 250 years or more.
Yeah, probably.
And it is the lack of investment, the lack of money to reinvest in the farm that is one of the large contributing factors to the volatility we've seen in the last year and a half, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things which I'm really, really worried about is that 3 years from now we come out the other side of this with a price that is the new normal, whatever that new normal is, right? And we'll be in a position where there's still not enough money at the farm gate to enable the farmer to be able to reinvest in their farms. And so we've seen, I don't know, Arcelia, if you've seen this in Brazil, but I've been speaking to people in Ecuador and other places where the farmer that has the ability to charge very, very close to what the market price is, right, has used that high price that they've been getting to invest in their farms and pay down debt. And so they've come out of this in a much stronger position than they were, right? And that's going to spin up, I think, some of the increase in production that is going to be needed to return prices to a near normal. But we run the risk, especially in countries where the prices are controlled, where this is not going to happen at all. And so I'm kind of wondering, given your background, right, your thoughts to that sort of take on things.
Yeah, so I used to be, I think in one of these presentations there's a slide saying, okay, suppliers, it's sort of like big back to sort of theory, economic theory. So suppliers have very little power. They have a commoditized product.
Is that this one?
No, there's one that's sort of like with a hammer in the middle or something, and it says suppliers on one side and buyers on the other. So it's an analysis that simply says that suppliers have very little power. Buyers have all the power, because if you don't sell your cacao to me, then I'll go to your neighbor, right? It's the same product. No, it's Ecuador or whatever you have. But everybody knows we're going to over roast it, and then it all tastes the same, right? So in that way, it would be logical that suppliers would have very little to say and go down to the lowest price that would be acceptable before they would simply not want to pluck those cacao pods, right? And that's probably the situation we've had. I think, though, my thinking has developed a little bit since then, and I think another factor that seldom is talked about is, the state's intervention in cacao, which is enormous in West Africa. No, I mean, yes, there's a lot here in Europe as well, unfortunately, with the subsidies, et cetera, but in Africa, it's a whole system. No, countries that live off cacao, one crop, and therefore incentivize the growing of that crop. And I think that is very likely to have caused also an oversupply. And how will that be solved in the future? I think there has to be a paradigm shift in cacao. Another thing is, it doesn't make sense if you look tropical countries versus developed countries. In developed countries, you wouldn't have an apple plantation of less than 100 or 150 hectares. No, it wouldn't be economical, right? So I think the same probably should be correct for cacao. You probably need to plant cacao on more modernized farms where you can get a tractor in. You should use irrigation, normal agricultural techniques that you apply here to cacao. And I think there's a special responsibility for the chocolate makers to think anew. No, I mean, come on, you've been thinking the same for 200 years, no? Yeah. A commodity products, you don't really respect your chocolate. No, it's about making a lot, no, and then trying to get the cost down, and survive 4 years as a CEO before you move on to your next job. Something like that is going on. Right?
Well, Frank, I think you hint at that in the slide here, right? So I'm a large buyer. I can think of the names of half a dozen just without really giving it much thought. What they're going to do is they're going to subsidize the farmer. Here's some free fertilizer, and you're going to sell us your cocoa when you get done. And then I'm going to determine the price because you owe me, right? Yeah. Their goal is to double production, whatever that means, productivity, right? Yeah. This is expanding worldwide production. But what happens is supply goes up, the price goes down. So this is a never-ending.
Remember, I have to stop you there, Clay, because it is preposterous. I remember going to conferences where NGOs and these that were founded by the big chocolate guys, as their sort of their fronts, they were going around helping farmers to produce more so they would have a higher income. That was really what they were saying, and nobody questioned them. Nobody.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And then, we're going to do good by providing training and education. We're going to worry about gender equality, which in some cultures is not an issue. So imposing, Western European values on cultures is you need to do with a lot of care, because you're making assumptions that they think the way that you do, which is not something that you should do at all. And then, the issue around, what is okay child labor and what is illegal child labor. So again, impressing values on top of them. But what's interesting about that is that everything is about perpetuating the status quo. And if we're going to perpetuate the status quo, that is not a solution, right? And so one point that you made that I want people to think about is that NGOs perpetuate the primacy of the individual smallholder farmer. It's important to keep the individual smallholder farmer on the individual smallholder farm, therefore depriving them of collective bargaining power. And so is one of the things that we want to take a look at is actually saying, no, let's get 100 farmers together and let's create a cooperative, and we've got 250 hectares, and now we can do something interesting with the collective value. I mean, am I reading it right in what you're saying there and what you're thinking?
Of course. Yeah. My thinking is more sort of free market. Like let's try to differentiate our product. Let's think like a business, no. And unfortunately, cooperatives, they think on the production side mainly, no. So back to when I was before I started CHOCO in the NGO context, we actually tried to promote the idea of what later became CHOCO to cooperatives, no. And it turns out that nobody were takers, no, because they want to produce. They don't know how to take the products to market, right? And that in itself is really difficult, as you can see from the craft chocolate market. We have not succeeded yet, right? And so it's a really tough nut to crack that one, not to be underestimated.
Yeah, I look at, for example, one of the most successful cooperatives in Peru, which used to be called Cepi Cafe, and now it's called Norandino. Right. And one of the reasons why it is successful is that they had professional full-time management, right, from the beginning, right, realizing that, also thinking about Peru. I mean, one of the reasons why the Salón del Cacao y Chocolate in Lima was created is because USAID, after investing, how many, tens of millions of dollars in the cocoa sector, realized we had just put on 1,000 new hectares of CCN 51, and nobody knew that this cocoa was available. And so what we had to do is we had to create a means to market Peruvian cocoa to the world, right? And so it's one thing to grow, it's another thing to sell. This is a lesson of fair trade. Like only about 40% of all the cocoa that's grown under fair trade terms is sold, right, and earns the premium. And that's a real challenge, I think, all the way around. One more slide, Frank. And I think this shows, a whole lot of the sort of the prophetical nature of what you were talking about back in 2014. Well, I look at this and I'm going, oh my gosh, if I think about this, and I think about, what's going on in the world right now, right? It's here. Number one, right? If there is no poverty reduction, that's going to lead to marketplace volatility. And yes, absolutely. I believe it's a major contributing factor to why we saw the price of cocoa do what it is that we did. Perfectly predictable. We have climate change. We have a weather event we know about, El Nino. We have aging trees, aging farmer populations. All of these things had to happen at the same time in 1 year, right? Right. And if it happens as the third year in 3 years of short production, we run into the situation and complicated by the EUDR and uncertainty about, the disposition of cocoa in Europe after December 31st, 2024. I mean, there were a whole lot of things which just contributed to this. So a black swan event, which ended up happening. Nobody thought all of these things would happen together. They happened together, and then the speculators jumped in and caused everything to blow up. Right? But this whole notion, number one, no poverty reduction, volatility in the marketplace, no replanting. And by replanting, I'm also going to just talk about, taking care of the farm. So we don't have enough money to reinvest in making sure the trees are healthy, to be able to take unproductive trees, maybe replace them with new trees, or to graft with higher productivity grafts onto the tree. There's no replanting, supply lag problems. I mean, we look at, what's going on in the Philippines and places like that. Yeah, they're all going in and saying, we're going to grow more cocoa. And so that'll solve the problem 3 years from now. But, if all that's going to do is lower the price again, right? So and nobody's going to be happy.
No,
the status quo, nobody's going to figure it out. So there is an incentive to use low cost and slave labor, right?
I sometimes say it's a parallel situation to the one in the U.S. during the the cotton farmers in 1861 or whatever. The prices of cotton had gone down, so that was the argument for slavery back then, because they really needed to keep their costs low. And a little bit that's I think the same economic factor you see coming in here. Why are people using slaves? I mean, that's crazy. Well, it's because prices are so low; they're not in the money. The same thing. Just one more comment on it is that deforestation. My theory. Now we're talking about the EU. Efforts to reduce deforestation. I think again because you don't have money to buy land, as nobody owns the rainforest in these countries, then it's free to go out and just put your seed plant some cacao there and see if it grows, right? And that's probably why when there's more demand for cacao, you try to do it the lowest cost possible, right? So you use communal lands and you just seed plant and you hope that you get some more production out of it. And that won't stop unless there's something done with the pricing and the skewed incentives that low pricing are giving.
Right. I also want to point out, I think that there's an acceptance of responsibility problem here, which is, at least, especially in the last 60 years, what we do is we see big chocolate, big cocoa, like externalizing all these risk factors off their balance sheets and not taking responsibility for the collateral damage that they're doing. And so I think one of the first thing that needs to happen in terms of addressing this in the big future is holding big chocolate and big cocoa responsible. Number one, you guys have been planning to get rid of, illegal child labor in your supply chains. Harkin Engel is 20 years, right? No, next year, do it. You guys, just do it rather than kicking the can down the road. Hold the responsibility. What is the economic cost? Is not just hold them responsible. Get them to if the chocolate business writ large is about $180 billion a year, right? Can we take 10% of your profits from all of you guys, right, and just reinvest it in the farms, right, to make sure that this in the future? I mean, it seems to make sense, but until Big Chocolate says yes, it's our fault, right, or not our fault, but we're going to take responsibility for it, nothing is going to happen. Right. And the question is, does the market have the appetite to make the change? Right. And I don't know if the market has the appetite to make the change.
Well, it's difficult, right? Because it's sort of like the chicken and egg thing, because we talked about the market challenge for craft chocolate, for fine flavored cacao. The thing is, it's never really broken through. And in part is probably because nobody's put some muscle behind it, right? Now, so until they start to do that, it'll be difficult to explain why the chocolate suddenly is more expensive, because it has to be more expensive. None of the big chocolate makers are actually making a lot of money. They're just barely making their cost of capital.
Yeah.
And only by continuing their cost reductions. No? So the world's biggest chocolate maker by Calbu, very low cost, no? But it's really a race to the bottom where, any little cost variation in manufacturing, whatever, 2 cents or whatever, makes a big, big difference for their bottom line. These guys, for instance, Barry Callebaut, I know, are looking at farms now in Brazil to own farms and produce themselves. So it does. So I don't know what's going on, of course, in the corporate offices of Barry Callebaut, but it is a sign that they're starting to think about maybe we should start to take responsibility for the production side as well. But they will still see that they also need more price for their cacao. So there's no way around solving this problem unless we get away from the commoditization and achieve some kind of premiumization of cacao and chocolate. The prices people are paying, at the stores is simply too low, and we've gotten them used to that. It is a commodity product and with a lot of sugar.
Yeah, I have a whole lot of thoughts on that last point, which is why hasn't it broken through, right? If we were to start that conversation, we'd go for another hour, and it wouldn't be chocolate. But I would love to have the conversation with you privately about that and come back about this, because I think it's very interesting. But we're at the end of the hour. It's just flown by. What I want to do is just let everybody know that Frank, in addition to being a management consultant and a tech entrepreneur, also runs a chocolate business, which is called CHOCOA Gourmet. Now, I'm going to assume from what it is that I read here, Frank, is that you don't sell beans. CHOCOA Gourmet is no longer in the business of selling beans. You're only in the business of selling your own chocolate products. Is that correct?
Yeah, we phased out the bean sales. No, we try to keep sales going with the very loyal customers, et cetera, especially within the craft environment. But we are going away from it to only sell our own couverture. The reason being that, a single variety cacao needs to be roasted, optimized for that variety, and we've spent a lot of time, a lot of money to go through, different roasting profiles in order to express the flavor in the best way. And I think also the market challenge is such that you do need to go door to door. What we're selling is to high-end restaurants, Michelin, bistro gastronomy, these kind of where the chef really appreciates flavor, and these guys get it. No, you don't have to explain all the economics and whatnot. You just give them a piece of chocolate, they taste it and go, wow, because they're used to tasting good ingredients. They know that's key for their kitchen. And so I think that's the way in this market. No?
Right. And I also think that the attitude of the chef in the kitchen when it comes to a fine dining restaurant, especially when we were talking about something that's earned a Michelin star and above, is that their clientele is about appreciating these experiences, and they're expecting to pay a premium price for the experience, which is very different from a commodity and bulk chocolate. But you just want to let everybody, this is the homepage of CHOCOA Gourmet right now. It's the link to it is on this post. It's on this post on the Chocolate Life. So you can go to CHOCOA Gourmet. It's here on somewhere. If it's not, I will make sure that it's in here. Oh, it may not be. I will add it in. That's really crazy.
And you're welcome to put my email there as well if anybody has any questions. I mean, ultimately, our vision, Clay, just to round it up, I know that the hour is gone, but our vision is to change the industry. It's not just about Choco. I mean, we want to have success, recuperate our investments over the last 20 years. But we also really want to change things. So if we can in any way be helpful to other players out there, absolutely be open about that. So we can get something going here.
Definitely, I think it's a rising tide lifts all boats, right? And, Frank, one of the reasons why this is part of the larger conversation, why I think what I prefer to call specialty chocolate hasn't broken through, right, is that, there are at least 3,000 to 5,000 new makers in the last 20 years, right? And there is no anywhere near consensus about what the values that we have, where we're not speaking a common language. When we use the term beat a bar or craft or something like that, none of us mean the same thing, right? And if we in the industry are confused about what no wonder the consumers are confused, And so I think that one of the things that needs to happen to break through is around coming to this communications consensus and being able to communicate it effectively, right? And when you're a very, very small chocolate maker and you don't really have a marketing budget, you don't actually have the resources to go out and communicate. And so, one of the realizations I came to is that if we get the craft chocolate industry, the specialty chocolate world together, and you consider them together, we're bigger than Tony's Chocolate Lonely. More farmers, more cocoa, more than 100 million in sales. What's the difference? They have one message and they can hammer their message consistently. Whereas the world of specialty chocolate can't. So I just wanted to put that out there. But this is the homepage of CHOCO. You can, if you want to communicate with Frank, email addresses to communicate with him are on the website, right? So they can go there. If you're on LinkedIn, you can find Frank's LinkedIn profile, and you can connect to him directly on LinkedIn. So I just wanted to make that connection rather than actually put your email address on this post, which means that all the search engine spiders will go and find it, and it'll go in ways that you never anticipated. So privacy is something that some amount of data privacy is something I'm interested in. Frank, we're at the end. Last words from you about anything that you wanted to talk again, we could go on for hours and hours and hours about this, but is there some, primary point you wanted to make before we close about this?
Well, just reinforcing again that every journey starts with one step. I think it was Chairman Mao who said that. No, and so a journey of 1,000 miles. And I think so I think all of us who are in this, you could say, business of trying to create products that we really like. Something that we really think tastes well, give us a great experience to whoever eats it. We need to work our way from the consumer and backwards and simply take responsibility for the chain. I think that's how we can start changing an industry that's just become, it can't be fun to be the CEO or the marketing director for one of these big chocolate companies. The chocolate doesn't taste of anything. There's a lot of sugar in it, and come on, and people are not, farmers are not getting any better conditions than, nothing has happened over the last 30 years. Let's just face it, right? Let's be adults, and so let's try to go on this journey together, small and big guys. I'm also saying this, reaching out to the big guys as much as possible, because some of them should at a certain stage realize that this is not what I was here on this planet to do, right? I need to do something good for everybody.
Right. And the big companies also have the resources to solve the problem, whereas small companies, it's much, much harder. So I want to add one point to the one you made about a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, right? And which is to say, we can't let perfection get in the way of progress. So I don't want to let, the discussion about let's move towards a definition of specialty chocolate, right, being like the one in specialty coffee, which I think is a good place to go. We can agree that any specialty chocolate is made with specialty cocoa beans. What are specialty cocoa beans? There's no consensus around that right now, but I can say, hey, okay, let's give ourselves 3 to 5 years to arrive at consensus, but let's start today. This is the goal. What we want to do is preferentially, right, move consumers away from commodity chocolate to commodities made with specialty cocoa beans, right? Let's start that effort today. Let's agree on that's the goal, right? And then let's worry about the fine tuning of definitions. Let's not get in the way of starting. And that for me is perhaps the most inspirational aspect of what it is that you've done, right? So you've got a model at CHOCO Gourmet. Some other people have adopted parts of the models and adapted it into other things. But what you've shown is that there is an economic model. There is a way to treat the farmers. There is a way to have a sustainable business if you think about it this particular way. And so, it's really important to me when I talk to my chocolate consulting clients to say, who are your models? Who are your mentors, right? So if you say, well, the Mast brothers were successful, and if I make chocolate and wrap chocolate like the Mast brothers did, I will be successful. Without understanding that they had a $7 million investment in them from people who were really, really good at image marketing, right? So if you don't have that $7 million and you don't have really good image marketing behind you, are you going to be able to be successful? The answer is no. And so for anybody who watches this at any time, today or in the future, if you're looking for models to take a look, successful models, ones that have made significant impact in the industry, right? I point people to what it is that Sean Eskenazi has done in terms of taking personal responsibility for what he's doing. But then what it is that you've done, Frank, in a very, very different way, is one of these models that people should take a look at very, very closely, understand what it is you've done and say, this is a success. And this is a model that, I can prove it out in a spreadsheet and show to people who might be interested in investing how to make it work. Right. And I think that's for me, that is one of the greatest inspirations in looking back at the last decade of the work that you've done and the progress you've made. And I want to thank you for doing that and continuing to champion it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Clay. It means a lot to me. Thank you.
No, it's my pleasure. I'm glad. And I do want to remind something in my closing about Frank is he said, we work with chocolate, and chocolate should make people happy, right? Right. That's the goal. It's like, when I'm in the kitchen and I have my fingers in chocolate, it makes me happy smelling it. And I know that I'm making something that's going to make people happy. Right. So if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Until the next time, everybody. Oh, and this coming Friday, we're doing an episode around World Chocolate Day, which is Sunday, the 7th of July. So until then, Frank and everyone, enjoy. Ciao.
Adios.